Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And today we are going to be talking about a very simple and powerful and ancient astrological technique called Sect. SECT, which is looking at whether you were born at daytime or nighttime, and it has a huge influence on how you live your life, how the planets in your chart interact with each other and influence you. And so, sect, at the core of it is, like I said, just whether you're born at daytime or nighttime. And you can determine that by looking at whether the sun in your birth chart was above or below the horizon when you were born. And so the horizon is the point where your ascendant and descendant axis are. That's your ascendant is the point on the eastern sky that was rising over the east at the very moment you took your first breath and, incarnated into this world. And so the ascendant marks the horizon. And so you can look at a chart and see whether your sun was above the ascendant descendant axis or below it. And there's a lot of debates, for people who are born around sunrise and sunset, like, are you a day chart? Are you a night chart? Some people say that you're kind of this third in between liminal category because like sunset and sunrise are these liminal transition times. But for the purpose of this as an ancient Hellenistic technique, strictly looking at whether your sun is above or below the horizon generally is what will tell you whether you're a day chart or night chart. Um, and so if you're born at daytime, then that means that the sun is the sect leader, the luminary who is the most influential planet in your chart. But interestingly, if you're born at nighttime, your moon is actually your sect light. And so for people like me, who I was born at night, we talk so much about sun sign astrology. But for me, the moon in my planet actually has a bigger influence on me. And that's not to say the sun doesn't still influence me, but the moon influences me more as a night person. And then also, if you're born at daytime, Jupiter is your insect benefic, who is helping out with your sect, and Saturn is your insect malefic, who is a little less difficult for people born at daytime. Whereas for those of us born at nighttime, Venus is our insect benefic and Mars is our insect malefic. So Saturn is a little less difficult for people born at nighttime. And so understanding, whether you're born at daytime or nighttime and which planets are working the most in your favor and which planets are working, for me born at nighttime, Saturn is then my out of sect malefic. And so Saturn issues with structure, boundary, having, proper limits and containers on things, kind of existing in the day by day rules of society.
Mhm.
Those sorts of things can be a little more harder for us born at nighttime. Whereas Mars issues of feeling angry or aggressive or having difficulty controlling your temper or acting really rashly and impulsively, those issues can be more difficult for people born at daytime. So that's kind of a really high level piece of sect. We'll be just weaving the theory through the whole conversation, but really what I think is really important to understand about sect is one, it's simple. Anyone can calculate it. If you're confused at finding your horizon and your sun, please reach out to me or Lori. We're both astrologers who would gladly, help you take a look at your chart and figure that out. But it's a pretty simple thing to figure out, and it influences so many other techniques and so many other ways that we can look at our birth charts that I think it's a really important technique to be implementing because those folks who are born during the daytime have a much more solar consciousness way of being where they're much more external, they're much more focused on what they're putting out in the world, how they're seen, like what their reputation is, how they're participating in society, where people born at nighttime can have a more nocturnal lunar way of maybe being a little more intuitive or sensitive or relational or just a little like cozier, more introverted. And, this is obviously mitigated by so many other aspects in someone's chart. But yeah, Lori, what do you think about kind of solar consciousness and lunar consciousness and the different ways that we live depending on the sect of our chart?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always really interesting just to see how, like, almost like which planet people tend to relate to more because of their sect. Um, that is something that I do like to sometimes ask in readings, especially when I'm talking to somebody who is getting a reading but doesn't really know much about astrology. I think that's a pretty easy place to start is just, well, do you relate to more daytime themes or do you relate to more nighttime themes? Um, and then there are instances where my chart is a perfect example of it. I have a day chart, but my moon is my chart ruler. And so I have one of those like rare situations where, both are basically equally important, um, and might take up the same amount of energy and influence almost. So, and that does happen where sometimes you feel equally related to your sun and your moon.
Yeah, because there's so much nuance in every single one of our
Right.
lives. And that's, the more I've learned astrology and the more nuance you can dig into of all of these like mitigating factors and different things and the ways that we're all influenced by our charts. It's like no two charts are the same for the most part. I actually did make two
Mhm.
friends who are both Gemini risings who have really similar charts, which is just like a cute side story. But generally, like you don't have that many other people out there with similar birth charts to you. We're all pretty unique, which we know through our lived experiences as well. But
Mhm.
um yeah, it is. And it's interesting too. Like, we went to a retreat with Demetra George where she was talking about how, with so many C-sections being scheduled during the daytime because
Yeah.
it's more convenient for doctors to deliver babies during the day, she was kind of conjecturing on what the implications of that would be if we have more people in our society with a solar consciousness rather than a lunar consciousness, which I think is really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating topic. Like as more and more babies get planned, and doctors don't want to work during the nighttime as much. Um, yeah, it almost creates a full society of daytime people, of people who, maybe are a little more of the go-getter attitudes and have more of that like Mars type of energy to them. But then what happens to the lunar people? Because there's still going to be people born at night too. They are still gonna exist, but almost like few and far between. So I do wonder, I think about that a lot when she said that, like, what is gonna happen to those lunar people, and how are they gonna feel as the society becomes more solar driven? Which honestly, I feel like the society our society, at least already is pretty solar driven.
Absolutely. We're already there for the
Yeah, we're
most
already
part,
there.
and um
Sure.
well, because also one thing that Jason Hawley pointed out, that's the difference between the sun and the moon, is that when the sun's in the sky, when it's daytime, we have this
Mhm.
illusion of like singularity, that the sun is the only star in the sky because it's so bright that it
Yeah.
outshines everyone else and no one else is visible. And that can be a very solar way of being like, I am the center
Sure.
of the universe. I'm shining, I'm going to outshine others. Whereas when you come to the moon's domain and at nighttime, you see that we actually live in this multiplicitous universe where there's infinite stars, scattered across the sky, and that lunar consciousness is much more about with the multiplicity and the relationships, right? Of the, during the day, you're going out and you're in your community and you're putting things, like especially daytime consciousness can be really thought of as spirit. And so you're really in this spirit realm where you're putting out into the world. But then when you come home in the evening and it switches to nighttime, you're at home with your family and your loved ones and people close to you and you're cozier. And, that's more like the Venus Mars relational aspects as well. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think we're already pretty far down that route of the
Yeah.
more
That's true.
solar society, but it is interesting to think about the different ways. And especially if you are
Mm.
a lunar nocturnal person, giving
Mhm.
yourself space to be a little more sensitive and intuitive. And, you have to feel your way through the dark when the moon is out. You have to use your senses a lot more than just sight.
Mhm.
And so, that might not be as prioritized as much in this world, but it is super important to, live it out. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's also a really good point. And yeah, it is so interesting, I think, um when you put it in those words, how there are so many stars in the sky and there are so many different things you can see when the moon is out. And this is something I think about a lot with tarot too, because there is the sun, the moon, and the star cards. Um, and I always say, like, when I do see the moon card, my favorite way of describing that card or how I teach it in tarot school, I always say when the sun is out, you can see, right? It's bright, it's illuminated, it's like fully lit up. But when the moon is out, you can't necessarily see. And so the moon tarot card, at least, is the card of anxiety. It's a card of fear. It's a card of hesitation. And it's very intuitive. And there's so many like beautiful, positive things about the moon card as well. I'm not saying it's all negative, but it's the ocean, right? Like when you think about the ocean, when you think about the tides and the waves and all of that being tracked back to the moon cycle, it just like, we don't know what's in there, right? Like, there's so much depth, and you intuitively know, "I'm gonna go to a certain point, and then I'm not gonna go farther. Because if you go any farther, I mean, you're probably not coming back, right? And the ocean is just so deep, and that's the way I think about the moon and the moon card also, and then when I think about the star card as well, like, the star is the card that follows the tower. And when you really like think about the tower being that Mars energy, right? Like chaos, like it's kind of that shit happens card, right? Like just things do come crashing down and you can either choose to be a part of it or not. And the star is the card that follows the tower. It's the card that says, okay, yeah, but what did we learn, right? Like that very Aquarius energy. And so I love the way that those 3 cards kind of interact because, you can't really see the stars without the darkness of the tower, the darkness of night, of, the bad things that happen sometimes. You need the darkness to see those lights, but then, you flow from the star to the moon, and you really end up in this space of, like, fear and anxiety of what comes next, but just because the lights are off doesn't mean that there's a sea monster 10 feet in front of you, right? Like it doesn't mean that there's
mhm.
actually something there. There's just a fear of the unknown that kind of comes around with it. And then when you move into the sun card, it's like the sun comes back up and there's that like childlike Leo energy, the naked baby. Um and one of my favorite things about tarot too, not to get too off topic, is the fact that every character in every card after the tower is naked. And
Mm.
if you really pay attention to it, everyone's naked. And there's like this aspect of like, I just don't care anymore. Like, I've been stripped of whatever happened in the tower. And now I'm just like, I'm here, right? Like, there's the naked woman in the star, there's the naked baby in the sun. And then, judgment, they're all naked. The world, she's naked, like everything beyond that point. And there's almost like a freedom, I think, that is really like interpreted by that.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of one of those spaces where tarot and astrology really overlap for me personally. Just because I love to think of the sun and the moon just like in terms of how those cards play out for people as well.
Mm. That's so beautifully said. And
Thank you.
yeah, I really think it speaks to the archetypal nature of astrology. And I would venture tarot as well, that if you're just
Hmm.
thinking like, well, what is the sun? Like what is solar consciousness? Any of us can answer that question, but like we all know the sun. Like how do you experience the sun? How do you witness it? How do you feel
Hmm.
it? And then making your own sense of it through that. And so like
Yeah.
Lori, you're gonna approach it through tarot. and your
Mhm.
understanding with that. And maybe I might reflect on the herbal qualities of St. John's wort as an incredibly solar plant and think about what St. John's wort can teach me about the sun, or what mugwort can teach me about the moon, or what, the myth of Artemis or Selene or these moon goddesses can teach us. And so just exploring all those different threads, those breadcrumbs, as you would call them,
Mhm.
of,
Yes.
what makes sense to you about like solar and lunar ways of being, and where do you see that around you in the world?
Mhm. Yeah, and also like where is your sun in the chart? Where is your moon in the chart? Like for me they're both over the horizon line. Um and for some people they're both under the horizon line, right? I think yours are both under.
Yeah.
Um yeah,
And
go
one
ahead.
thing I really like to think about with that is and with all the planets, but especially the sun and moon, is what
Mhm.
did they look like at the moment you were born? Like, obviously, you were being born and you could
Yeah.
not just like step outside and witness the living sky in front of you. But like, if someone were to have stepped outside and witnessed the living sky at the moment you were born, what would the
Yeah.
sky have looked like? What planets would be up above the horizon or below? Like, what phase was the moon? How much light did she have? What shape? Is she waxing? Is she waning? Like, I was born just before sunrise. My sun is in the second house. And so, I've literally gone outside and looked at the sky at the time that the sun is the same number of degrees from the horizon as it was when I was born, and witnessed like that pre-sunset. You can tell the sun's
Mhm.
coming up, the light's like peeking out, but it still is pretty dark. Or like Lori, I know we've talked about this with your eighth house sun, or also someone's
Yeah.
12th house sun. Like the eighth and 12th house are the points like before sunset is the eighth house, and after sunrise is the 12th house. And those are the 2 points where the sun is at these like blinding, like when the sun's out and you're just like, oh,
Right.
it's like so. And so, what did the sky actually look like when you were born?
Yeah, and that dark house energy, I mean, I know I've talked about this in other episodes, and if you know me in person, I talk about this constantly anyway. Um, but every time I'm like driving at like 5 p.m., and I see the sun like blinding me through the car window, I'm always just like, it's me, like just blinding people on their way home from
Literally.
work. Yeah, and I don't know why it just it took something that was so annoying because it's frustrating, it's hard to see, and almost made it this cute little, like, "Oh, ha, I was blinding people when I was born, like, that's my son." And it just kinda adds this little bit of, like, almost like, I don't wanna say inside joke type thing, but it just kinda brings this like, inner peace almost, and I just love that, duality of, like, having a dark house sun, but when the dark house sun is above the horizon, it's so bright
Hmm.
that it's blinding.
Hmm.
And for me, the moon was out too. My moon is on my MC in my 10th house, so it like would have been at the very top of the sky, like very crescented. And so yeah, I think about that all the time too when I see the sun setting and I see a little bit of a sliver of a moon up at the top of the
Hmm.
sky. That's my chart. That's
And
the
when the
moon phase that I
moon
was born
is
under.
at the same phase, I think we shared this in our moon phase episode.
Yeah, I
But when
think
the
we
moon is
did.
at the same phase in the sky where it was when you were born, is a boost in fertility and creativity and lunar topics for
Mhm,
you. So knowing what your moon phase is and paying attention to when the moon is actually in
mhm.
that phase by transit is like a little astrological hack you can do as well.
Yeah, and actually, I was thinking about that this morning because the sun is in Aquarius and the moon is in Aries right now. And
Yeah, it's
that's my
literally
sun and
you.
moon.
Yeah.
I think it's moved into Taurus by now. But this morning it was still a later degree of Aries. And I woke up at like 7 a.m. this morning and I just went outside and looked up at the sky at the sunrise and I was like, "Oh my God, sun and moon are they're me today." Like
Literally.
I always love that. Yeah, like when you have your solar and lunar return, like in the
Yeah,
same day.
that is
Um,
fun.
yeah, it's always my favorite time of the year because it's always just like I love watching the energies happen around me for the 2 to 3 days that my sun and moon are in their homes,
Yeah. Aw.
in my homes, not
Yeah.
their homes. Yeah.
Well, another thing I wanted to talk about a bit with sect is looking at kind of what are the sect mates or the other planets that are part of the sect. Because, like I said, if you're
Mhm.
a day chart, then Jupiter and Saturn are of sect in your chart. And if you're a night
Mhm.
chart, then Mars and Venus are of sect in your chart. And then Mercury changes sect depending on whether they were rising before the sun or setting after the sun, whether they were morning or
Mhm.
evening star. But and that's Mercury's changeable. And I mean, it would be interesting to do a whole episode on just how queer Mercury is and how they
Mm.
don't fit into any categories and they just move around
Yeah.
and you can't pin them down. So Mercury doesn't belong to any specific sect, but for the other planets, and this is also, working with the visible planets because it's an ancient technique from before, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered. But with the other planets, it can be really helpful to figure out what is your insect benefic. So if you're a day chart, then Jupiter is your insect benefic. And if you're a night chart, then Venus is your insect benefic. And then go to your chart and look at where that planet is placed by sign and house. But more importantly, look at the houses that that planet rules. So for me, as a Libra rising born at nighttime, Venus is my insect benefic, and she rules my first house of Libra and my eighth house of Taurus. And so then those topics, the topics of the houses ruled by your insect benefic, are topics where you might get some extra support or help or focus, or you might even have more fulfillment and meaning come into your life by focusing on those topics. And, it can be
Mhm.
complicated because my Venus, like really the only thing she has going for her is that she's
Mhm.
insect because she's in really difficult
Yeah,
conditions. So
she's a
I'm
night
not
chart.
saying that
Yeah.
like Venus topics just come easily to me, but there is a boost
Right.
and support given. And I would do well to focus more on Venusian ways of being, which are a lot more like night chart is a lot more about matter and what's physical. So Venus is really
Mhm.
focused on physical pleasures, feeling close with other people, eating delicious food, nice aesthetics and textures and art and beauty. Those are the sorts of things Venus is associated with. And so I would do well to try to cultivate those in my life as a night chart person. Whereas if you're born during the daytime, looking at the houses that Jupiter rules in your chart and cultivating those topics in your life, as well as kind of the general topics of Jupiter of, bringing more faith and optimism, focusing on what you believe in, what can you grow and expand. Those are being philosophical, engaging in spiritual meaning making, practicing gratitude, bringing those sorts of Jupiterian virtues into your life. But really, the ancient
Right.
technique that I want to stress here is looking at the houses that are ruled by your insect benefic as topics in your life that can bring you more abundance and support and joy and fulfillment.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
Um,
Not much to
and
add. That was great. Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, I was just have like a lot to say, so I wanted to pause in case you did have something. Because the other side
No,
of that
no,
coin
go on.
is looking at your out of sect malefic as a planet that
Mhm.
you really want to try to keep in check and a planet that can bring more difficulties into your life. And so looking at not only the house where your out of sect malefic is located, and if you're a night chart, then Saturn is your out of sect malefic. And if you're a day chart, then Mars is your out of sect malefic. And then also looking at the houses that your out of sect malefic rules as topics that may be a little more difficult, delayed, inhibited, frustrating, unconventional. But in a lot of ways, the out of
Mhm.
sect malefic will bring forms of hardship into our lives. And
Mhm.
if you're someone who's born around sunrise or sunset, looking and trying to figure out whether Mars or Saturn has brought more difficulties into your life can be a way to figure out if you're more of a night chart or day chart person. And so, Saturn issues can be issues of isolation, of control, of like issues with authority, issues with structure and boundaries. Saturn can bring chronic, long-lasting issues into our lives.
Mhm.
And then Mars issues can bring more like impetuousness, conflict, temper issues, issues with violence, even. And Mars issues can be a lot like more shorter and unexpected, whereas like Saturn's a slow moving planet and you see her coming. So a lot of times you're not like surprised by Saturn's issues, even if you're like, wow,
Yeah.
I was really hoping it wasn't going to go that way. So
Right.
those sorts of issues, but then looking at the houses ruled by Mars and Saturn in your chart and seeing like for me, Saturn rules my home and foundations and Mars rules my relationships. So then I could look, I mean, I know I'm a night chart person, but if I was trying to figure it out, I could look like, well, has my home been more
Mm.
difficult or my relationships? And so that's a way to kind of figure out if you're a day or night chart person when you're born with your sun near the horizon. But just knowing, and part of the reason for this is because Saturn is a cold planet. And so at nighttime, she becomes excessively cold and rigid and brittle,
Yeah.
whereas Mars is a hot planet. And during the daytime, they become excessively hot and impetuous
Mhm.
and rash. And so if you
Like
know
too
that sort
much.
of energy, like I can work to warm up my Saturn and Lori can work to cool down her Mars. Not saying you need to, but just like in the example of of Sect. So yeah, looking at which planets and also the way that planets work together. So Saturn and Jupiter and the Sun are on the same team, they're working together. Moon, Mars, and Venus, they're on the same team and they're working together. And so looking at how they talk in the chart, these are kind of the
Mhm.
nuances that you can really look at to understand how your planets kind of help and hinder you depending on whether you're born during the day or night.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And there are always nuances too. There can be things that almost counteract other things, or change other things. I would say, like to use my chart as an example again, Mars is my difficult planet. And my 10th house is where my moon is. So they're in a mutual reception, meaning that they are just in each other's home signs. And they're squaring each other. And it's an applying square as well. So it's like there's so much going on with the conversation between my moon and my Mars. And so even though I have a day chart, and my 10th house is supposed to be more of a difficult area because of that Mars energy, I think having my ascendant also being in Cancer where my Mars is, like I think having that chart ruler be on my MC, like the way that those converse, um, can make it more intense or it can almost lessen the blow of things. So I do notice that when I feel in flow with my career, everything just happens. Everything just back to back, like falls into place like dominoes. But the second I start having to fight it or force anything or push it or do something I don't like, it's like the worst case scenario for me. Like having a 9 to 5 that I really particularly hated with a pretty abusive boss at one point was like, it was all I could think about. It, like, drained me from my entire life because it was, like, everything. And so now experiences like that, make a lot more sense to me, just understanding the sect of my
Hmm.
chart because, yeah, I just realized that, like, having your moon in your 10th house anyway, like, moon, Venus on MC, like, I have to do what I love, and that's super important, and, my MC is also ruled by Jupiter, which is my, benefic planet, so,
Yeah.
you know, they
And
can kind
well,
of help you.
this example too is such a good example of like planetary rulership from a traditional perspective because
Mhm.
the birth chart represents your entire life. Like it is not just
Right.
you. And especially from a traditional ancient perspective, like the first house is you. That's why the first house is so important, is because the topics of the first house are self and body and personality and you. And so then whatever
Yeah.
planet rules your first house literally is you in your chart. Like Venus is me in my chart as a Libra rising. The moon is
Mhm.
Lori in her chart as a Cancer rising. And so,
Mhm.
if you're looking at Lori's chart and you're like, oh, okay, there's a Mars in Cancer that, it's daytime. It might like there might be some difficulties there. Where's that coming from? Then you look to the Aries and Scorpio houses. And it's like, oh, Lori's boss is the problem, right? The ruler of her 10th is
Right.
literally Mars. And so it's not that Lori's the problem or that like her anger or her Mars issues are the problem. It's that she's experiencing Mars issues from someone else, in this case, her
Yeah.
boss, because it's the ruler of her 10th. If it was the ruler of her fourth, maybe it would be her parent, right? And so that's
Mhm.
another really important kind of distinguishing thing too, is that these issues that might come from your out of sect malefic may very well be external. They are probably not your fault.
Right, right. And yeah, and my fifth house is also that's Scorpio. That's my Scorpio house. So I do notice a lot of my creativity very much being tied to my career as well. And I think that's
Hmm.
another thing you can really look at when I've moved off on my own and like started a business, or when I do my own thing and set my own schedule. I have so much time and energy to be creative and set whatever I want and do whatever I want. And I feel like both of those houses really thrive in those cases.
Hmm.
But then in those cases where I have had to just get a job to have a job and try to get insurance, or whatever the different reasons were for different jobs that I've had, um, when I was miserable at work, I didn't have the time and energy to come home and do any of my creative projects. So it
Mm.
made me feel angry because I felt so stagnant in life. And so, like, even just looking at how those houses are always going to be tied together, and they are always kind of speaking on each other's behalf and kind of helping each other out. It can give you a lot of insight onto like why you feel certain ways. And, for me, the answer was quitting the job and doing things on my own, So,
Yeah, Aries 10th house, I'm my own
right.
boss.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and my 6th house is Jupiter ruled, so
Mhm. Absolutely.
yeah,
Well,
right.
that's yeah, that's such a great example. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I
Sure.
think that's kind of all I really had to say about Sect. Did you have anything else before we wrap up, Lori?
Um, I will say, kind of unrelated but related, going back to what I was saying about the tarot cards, Mars is the card that is ruled by the tower. Or Mars is
Mm,
the planet that rules the tower card, or however you want to word that. So what I didn't want to interrupt you earlier, but when you were talking about how Mars can be kind of chaotic, um, it's the tower.
that makes a lot of
So I
sense.
think, yeah, I think that can also be a really good way of thinking about that energy if you're coming into astrology from a tarot background, like I did.
What's the Saturn card?
The world.
Oh, very
Yeah, because
interesting.
it's finality and cycles. The world is the final card, and it's symbolic of a graduation, like the final planet in
Okay.
Hellenistic astrology, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Final visible planet, except for
Final
random
visible
moments when
planet.
Uranus is
Exactly.
visible.
Yeah.
All
Sounds
right.
about right.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, Sect is it's a really easy, simple technique to integrate. There's high level, like basic things you can do with it. And then I hope we also lined out how you can really go pretty in depth with Sect and do, a lot of technical analysis and really however much you want to do with your chart. Lori and
Hmm.
I are both really big proponents of simple is so powerful and so profound and so important. And so, even just looking at whether you're a day chart or a night chart and whether you have more of a solar consciousness or a lunar consciousness can just give you so much insight. And like freedom and support and empowerment to live how you feel internally, right? Especially for those of us who are more
Mhm.
nocturnal, allowing ourselves to not conform to the like really diurnal solar expectations of our society. Like we do need to do things differently, and that's okay. But yeah, keep it simple and reach out to us if you have any questions, any thoughts about how Sect works. We have a podcast Instagram now that we'll link down in the show
Mhm.
notes. We'll also put a few more resources to learn about Sect. I have Demetra George's book in front of me right now. This is such a good resource to learn about Sect.
Mhm.
So we'll put a few different resources. And yeah, what do you have going on right now, Lori? I think this will come out sometime in March.
March. Okay. Yeah, I am kind of transitioning right now. I'm going to be taking over the metaphysical supply shop that I'm the reader at. So I'm going to be kind of transitioning into owning it and taking on a lot more responsibility there. So I will definitely be busy. But I am always still doing readings. I am planning on kind of turning some of the back room space into a little bit of an office, so that I can take readings during the day and walk in or virtual or whatever. So I'm gonna have an actual space for that soon. And yeah, hopefully, I think really just offering my regular readings. If you're in the Cincinnati area, if you're local, we are going to be doing a ton of in-person events, especially the first opening week. And I am looking into eventually like streaming a lot of them. So when I teach tarot school in September, October, like I do every year, I'll probably find a way to stream it again. I did last time too. But I want to find a better way. That one wasn't great.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I'm gonna try to find ways to teach online as well as in person there. I'm more of an in-person
Very
person, but
exciting. And what's the opening week for your shop
yeah.
again, and what's it called?
We open on April 1st, or a grand reopening. It's already a pretty established shop. It's been there for 4.5 years almost. It's called the Mindful Nest in Cincinnati, Ohio. And my friend
How
is opening
exciting.
a coffee and plant shop in there as well called Grounded. So we're gonna
Yeah.
make it very community based. I'm gonna get a ton of astrology books. So if anyone is trying to get rid of some astrology books and needs a place to donate or sell them for cheap, we'll take them.
That's
Little
awesome.
shout
That's
out
such a
there.
great way to that's like such a great way to use your eighth house stellium as well. So I'm really excited to see what you guys do with the
Yes.
shop.
With my eighth house perfection year and eighth house
Mhm.
perfection month and the new moon, that was
Literally.
just on my Saturn in my eighth house.
So funny. Lori and I's perfection years are lined up. Like we're both in Aquarius
Hmm.
perfection years, but like we're different ages, so different houses. But then our
Different
perfection months are
houses.
also lined up. So we're both in eighth house perfection months right now as well, which is really cute, honestly.
That's cute. Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Collaborations.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Lori and I are talking about
Mhm.
me putting together some ritual herb blends that we would be selling in
Yes.
her shop, perhaps some steam
Mhm.
pots or bath salts. We're not
Mhm.
fully sure exactly what it'll be yet, but definitely putting some sort of ritual herbal blends, ways that you can build relationship with plants, because that's a big part of my philosophy as an herbalist is that plants are whole beings and interacting with them as beings and stating our intentions, seeking with them and inviting them and in to partner with us to, cultivate more health or success or love and connection or, whatever we're focused on, but really inviting the plants to partner with us and guide us and support us in that is my orientation. So definitely looking at putting together some blends to help
Mm.
folks integrate herbs into their magical and spiritual practices or help support what you're already doing with herbs spiritually. Um, so yeah, I'm really excited about that and having those in
Yeah,
Lori's
me
shop
too.
once they open.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you have to come get them.
Yes. So come to Cincinnati, come see Lori. Are you guys going to have stuff online?
Not right away, at least.
Okay, that makes sense. Don't do
Yeah.
too much.
Yeah. There's been a lot, so slowing
Awesome.
down a little bit.
Well,
Yes.
thank you everyone for listening. As always, reach out with any thoughts or questions. And yeah, talk to you guys soon.